he tio, he hoka, he hauhu, ti he wā muri ora. Mihi ana ki te atua, no nā te timatanga te hakamutunga o ngā mea katoa. Me rangi nui e tui honei, me papatōnuku ki takoto nei. Tēnā koroa, tēnā koroa. Nau mai, hara mai ki tēnei hōtaka o te wā, he me ngā, nau mai ki ngā kai kōrero o te rā, me ngā tangata I whakarongo mai ana I te ipurangi. Nau mai, hara mai. Welcome everyone to this webinar today. Just before we get started, I am one of your hosts today, Troy Brockbeck, and I just wanted to give a thanks to those people who have brought this webinar here today, first and foremost. One of the groups that have brought this is a joint webinar today. One of the groups that have brought this today is Water New Zealand, and in particular the climate change group. And it's an interesting time for our industry as we navigate our way into these environmental concerns we have, but also around climate change, around carbon, but also navigating our pathway between Te Ao Māori and Te Ao Pākehā, Western world and Indigenous world. So I just give acknowledgements to Water New Zealand for allowing us today to have these kōrero, and thank you very much. One of our other partners that have brought this webinar today is the Engineering New Zealand Sustainability Society, aroha mai. And we've got Ed here who's just going to say a few words. Kia ora, Ed.
Kia ora, Troy, and kia ora e te whānau, ko Ed Clayton, tāku ingoa, he committee member hau ki the Sustainability Society, kei tamaki makaurua hau e noho ana. So yeah, hello to everyone attending today. I'm a committee member for the Sustainability Society and based here in Auckland, and we're really excited to be a part of this webinar. And when Troy and Water New Zealand approached us about this, it was great to see this level of interest coming through from our audience. It's sort of been a continuation of some of the webinars that we have been showing earlier, so we're really excited to sort of be able to participate in this and support this in the back end. So I'd also like to acknowledge my colleague Sarah Bowman at the Sustainability Society is also helping today. But yeah, and we'll really like to welcome all three of the panelists. We're really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. So thank you very much.
And also just a big shout out to Catherine Taiapa as well for all the effort she's put into organising this. It's not just myself, it's not just the panelists, but there's a whole crew behind the scenes that you may not be able to see helping to make this happen. So kia ora to everyone. I'm just going to hand the rako over to the other MC for today, the tuahine Emily. O atu ki aku.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Emily a whoa aho. So as Troy's kindly introduced, I'm helping MC today, and I think thanks for the intro, Troy and Ed, about Water NZ and TSS, and to Catherine, but let's get into it. So we're here today to discuss Māori worldviews, climate and carbon pathways, with our panel sharing perspectives on how holistic Māori worldviews and aspirations for kaitiakitanga can inform climate action and carbon zero pathways in Aotearoa. So I'd like to briefly introduce our esteemed panelists, who we are very honoured to have join us today. Ngā mihi nui nui kia koutou. Although I'll let them expand further when they introduce themselves around who they are, where they're from, and what they're doing in this climate and carbon space, cognizant of Te Ao Māori. So first, in the order of speaking as well, I'd like to introduce Matthew Tukaki, who among other honours is the CEO of the Māori Carbon Collective and the chairman of the National Māori Authority of New Zealand. Our second panellist is Donna Awatere Huata, a wahine toa and fierce advocate for Māori, and also wearing the hat of the Māori Climate Commissioner, providing advice and Māori-focused research to assist Aotearoa meeting our target under the Paris Climate Change Agreement. Our third speaker, another leader who is wearing many hats, is Johnny Freeland, and he's helping navigate a whakapapa-centred response to climate change within Tāmaki Makaurau through the Mana Whenua Kaitiaki Forum. So we'll hear from each of them in turn. As a little note, I think for the structure today, Matthew, Donna and Johnny will each kōrero for 10 to 15 minutes. Hopefully we won't be ringing any bells for time caps. And then we've saved 30 minutes at the end for questions. So if I can recommend everyone use the Slido throughout this kōrero to upvote questions, to add your questions. And if you do have a question for a particular panelist, just to include their name in it. So without, I guess, further ado, you don't want to hear from me anymore. Matthew, can you please start us off? Ko waikoe, no he koe, he ahatu mahi.
Well, tēnā koe, kia ora, everyone. My name is Matthew Tukaki. I am very fortunate to hail from a little island off the coast of Mount Maunganui known as Mātauranga Island, a place that I like to call the last sovereign bastion of Aotearoa, but that's a whole other story. Coming from an island off the coast of another island nation, I can tell you that climate change is one of the biggest issues that we're dealing with. A little bit more about my background, just to set the scene. I'm also the Executive Director of the New Zealand Māori Council, and the New Zealand Māori Council is one of this country's oldest Māori organisations, and something quite unique insofar as we have our own Act of Parliament, legislated under the Māori Community Development Act of 1962. And in there is a section called Section 18, which of late I've been very liberal in both its interpretation and its use. And essentially it allows us to intervene on behalf of Māori around a number of different kaupapa, from Mātauranga tamariki right through to economic development, housing, and so on and so forth. Previously to this though, I've spent nearly 20 years working internationally. I was very fortunate to have been Australia's representative to the UN Global Compact, which is the business and industry side of the UN system, and the first New Zealander to sit on a board of a governing institution of the UN, the UNGC as well. In terms of climate change and water and sustainability, I've been involved in that sector for a very long time. The first piece of work I ever did was a review of Australia's Cooperative Research Centre into Freshwater Ecology. And I'd actually forgotten until I was doing some research for this particular hui that I'd actually gone and done that. And all I can say is thank God for Google. You get to find the things you've done. When you get to my age, the dementia starts to set in a little bit. And of course, I was very fortunate to have chaired Deakin University's SARO, which is a collaboration of sustainability research centres. So I've been around the track on all the major issues from water through to climate and sustainability. For the purposes of this particular talk, I'm going to try and integrate all three in terms of my worldview, Māori worldview. But I just want to, before I do that, say what a great pleasure it is to be here with my whanaunga, Donna Awatiri Huata, an amazing wāhine toa in the world of Māoridom. And I'm just pleased we're here together, Donna, so kei te pai. There are three major issues that I'm dealing with at the moment, and I thought I'd give you some insight into one of them. The first is when it comes to water. The New Zealand Māori Council and others were behind the big water claim before the Waitangi Tribunal some years back now, and it hasn't been until recently that some of those recommendations have filtered out. And the case was very much about Māori ownership rights and interests in water. And this is not just unique to water, it's also the same argument being mounted by Māori when it comes to spectrum, for example, but also taonga, to the other big resource-based claims that are out there. And why is that so important to understand? Because you've got to understand what Māori are fighting for. It's not just about ownership and rights and interests, it is also about the ongoing degradation of our natural assets. The reality is that when it comes to water, our waterways are about as degraded as they get, even though internationally we espouse this image of 100% clean and green. Then the reality on the ground is just not the case. So the first interest of Māori from the case of the Māori Council and others is that we have a right to both own and have an interest in, because we feel an inherent right to protect and guard our resources, our natural assets and resources. Call it guardianship, call it kaitiaki-ship, but that should never be set aside in some sort of negotiation around, well, that's it, that's the end of the deal. We don't need to talk about ownership. That also plays into the Y262 claim, which is around native flora and fauna. Primarily, our native species and our native flora continue to be degraded. One of the biggest concerns we have are around our freshwater ecology, our freshwater species. And why, again, that's so important is because of our innate connection to the water through both our stories, our culture. We live by the water, we live on the water in many cases, but we also feed from the water. And as the natural resources become even more depleted in this rush for more advanced forms of economic development, we're starting to lose one of the greatest assets that we have before us in this country. And no, I don't want anyone to think that I'm somehow some sort of greenie at the parapet fighting for some political narrative. Absolutely not. My only interest is in that for Māori when it comes to these things. And then, of course, the big one, the big ticket item is climate change. And climate change, and as Donna, I'm sure, will refer to as well, is something that impacts us greatly and keeps me awake at night somewhat. For example, we know that with rising sea levels, that we can expect an increase in the relevancy, and the prevalence of king tides. We've already seen that. And as I opened and said that I come from a little island off the coast of New Zealand called Mātauranga Island, let me tell you, one of the biggest fears I have, both from a cultural perspective and as an ownership perspective, is when I see our urupā begin to fall into the sea. That's where my people are buried on that coast. That's where my whānau, that's where my place to stand is. And as we face rising sea levels, we're also facing not only loss of whenua and loss of land, we're also facing a loss of culture and a loss of place and a loss of identity. And it's quite interesting, just the other week I was thinking what a difference a couple of years makes. When my father passed away 20 years and I always knew I was going to be buried in that same urupā, well, in all reality, I probably won't be now because the urupā might not even exist. And so when understanding the Māori worldview on all of these different issues, it's not just about, well, what are the right policy settings? It's not just about what are the things around economic development that we also have to be conscious of. And I'll reference it this way. When I led the delegation to Rio Plus 20, which is a big Earth Summit back in 2012, I think it is now, I had the fortune of spending a lot of time with a former colleague of mine, Gro Brundtland. Gro Brundtland, as some of you might know, is the former Prime Minister of Norway, notorious for being an angry middle-aged lady, but anyway, Katie Pai. But the thinking then and the thinking 20 years ago was very much about the integration of the three pillars of sustainability. The environmental pillar, the social pillar, and the economic pillar. The reality is that all three have to be moving in unison and going together in order to achieve the outcomes that we all need. Of course, we have to work more sustainably. Of course, we have to have more sustainable forms of economies. Of course, we have to ensure that we're providing relevant social services, housing and such. But we can't do that at the expense of the natural environment, because ironically enough, it's that natural environment that sustains us. My view is that we haven't got those policy settings right in this country at the moment, and that is because we do continue to ignore both the rights and interests of Māori, but also the way that Māori have handled these matters for many, many centuries. And using that Indigenous knowledge is not something that's emerged totally or completely in policy settings at the moment. The next thing I just want to focus my time and energy on is also, well, how do we sustain these things? I use the example of water. Our water infrastructure in the north and also in places like Taranaki are, let's just say, maintenance on our water infrastructure has fallen behind many hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. John Carter, the Mayor of the Far North District Council, will admit this. He's facing a drought up there. But then what we're not doing is we're not addressing the underinvestment in the very water infrastructure assets we already have. We saw the disaster in Wellington where one pipe disrupts the entire city. Or for example, in Taranaki, where the mayor there indicates an extra $300 million need to bring infrastructure up to play. Now, if you're a Māori and you know that you own these things, that you have an interest in these things, imagine your shock and horror when being told that we're literally billions of dollars in the hole when it comes to the management of one of the most critical assets in the country, which is water. From water storage to water infrastructure, from the drains and the pipes to so on and so forth. And then imagine shock horror when you're told that the number of Māori water engineers, because we have done nothing to invest in the capacity and capability growing of Māori skills base in this area, is from what I understand, only 5 Māori water engineers in this country, and yet what we do is we seek as much as we can offshore before growing our local talent onshore. And yet we have a number of our young people in particular who want to get into these professions and get into these careers. And so whether it be climate change, whether it be water, whether it be the natural environment, rethinking actually what it is we have, where it is we're going, and therefore what skills we need to have is something also quite critical when it comes to the Te Ao Māori world. And if I could just wrap up by saying on that front that there's an economic argument for it. The more of our people that we have in higher wage growth, higher skilled jobs, then that is one of the levers used to actually break the poverty cycle intergenerationally within our country. So coming back to those 3 critical areas when it comes to water, when it comes to climate change and the environment, the New Zealand Māori Council, the National Māori Authority, I haven't spoken about the Māori Carbon Foundation. We'll leave that one to another day as I continue the reforms of the organisation. Some say, oh, Matt, you know, you've got so many hats. I just say, well, no, it's like stamp collecting. You just have to collect a lot of stamps in order to get a good one going. But if I could just implore all of you to start thinking about the role that Māori can play within your own policy making, your own decision making, and your own development strategies as we move forward, and seek partnerships with Māori organisations and individuals, then that will actually add a huge amount of knowledge and value to your organisations. And if anything comes out of our little hui today, hopefully that small overview within 15 minutes or less gives you just a little bit of perspective. And I'm sure Don Awatiri Huata will say this as well. Happy to hui with anyone at any time, at any place, providing it's not in a dirty river. Ka kite.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Matthew. It's really insightful thoughts. It's struck a chord with me, the number of Māori water engineers that you mentioned being sort of around the order of 5, because I think 2 of them are here with Troy and myself. So that's an alarming thought. So I think it's a really strong thing to share with the audience, to think about our capacity building and breaking the cycle with a really resonant thought. So on that note, I'll pass it ako kia koe, Whaiadona. If you can share with us your thoughts on this topic, would be greatly welcome. Ko wai koe, no hea koe hea hato mahi.
Ai, kia ora tātou everyone, and firstly thank you, Catherine, for harassing me into doing this, and to Troy, who's kept up a daily barrage of emails to me. Well, as you can see, I didn't forget, and at my age, this is one of the things I do, is think what a wonderful idea that will be, and then in the rush of the moment, forget all about it. So I'm so happy that I actually made it. So kia ora, Catherine and Troy. I'm born and bred in Rotorua on the banks of the Utuhina River. I am Te Arawa, my mother is Te Arawa, and I whakapapa to the 8 Pumanawa, the 8 hapu of Te Arawa. My father was the second to last commander of the 28th Māori Battalion, who led the battalion through the Italian campaign, in fact led the Allied forces up the island. He is Ngāti Pro, and I wasn't born there, but nevertheless I've had an intimate relationship to the point where at one point in my life I spent 5 years building the runanga o Ngāti Pro, which is there, and sat on it for the first, I think, 5 or 7 years of its existence. Today, you know, when you have these webinars and, you know, introductory sessions into a big area, you can't hope to cover everything, you know, today. So the 2 areas that I need to talk to you about, firstly, the Māori worldview, and secondly, the political implications of the treaty today. I can't even do it in a day, let alone in 10 minutes. But what I thought I should do is just give you a snippet of an overview of the treaty perspective and the Māori worldview, and direct you to some of the amazing resources there are. There are a lot of writings that I think you as water engineers, would learn from and benefit from. So to just start, I want to go back to 1840, because we need to understand the genesis of the divergence in our thinking. And at the treaty in 1840, when Māori said, we will keep rangatiratanga to ourselves, meaning we'll just carry on self-governing and being self-determining as we have for centuries. But you, Pākehā, you may set up kauatanga government to look after yourselves. That was 1840. So the idea was to have two carts, the Māori cart and the Pākehā cart, and we kind of like trundle along. And at that time, the Māori cart was humongous, the Pākehā cart was a little weeny one. By 1870, the Pākehā cart was huge, and the Māori cart had been dismantled and its parts repurposed to empower the Pākehā cart. And that's where we've been ever since. Māori on the outside, sort of hanging on for grim life to the Pākehā cart, trying to do two things. One is to get in the driver's seat and share the cart with Pākehā and have a say. The other is to rebuild our own cart. And whichever direction we've gone in, Pākehā's have firstly pushed us off the cart and not allowed us on. And secondly, when we try to build our own cart, they've come along and set in place, either through underfunding or through very tino Pākehā KPIs, transformed our rangatiratanga initiative into something that mimics, is a pale version of the Pākehā original. So if I just use a few examples of fisheries as an example, when you look back, Māori were incredible fishermen, and I'm recommending to you now, if you can write this down, the Muri Whenua Waitangi Tribunal report, which gives an incredible summation of the level of our technology in fishing at that time. And we made our livelihoods, as many of the tribunal reports say, the ocean was our seed garden. It's our garden where we grow our kaimona. And by 1880, there was a piece of legislation passed that expressly forbade Māori to commercially fish. We were allowed to fish for our own sustenance and for the marae, but we could not take on commercial fishing. And pipe forward to 1963, when they revised the Fisheries Act, Māori were able to fish and get licenses, except we didn't. And the New Zealand Māori Council, led by Rangi Walker and Titipai Harawira, led a campaign to get Māori licenses, and led a campaign to get Māori to get some of the pūtea that was going to be made available to kickstart the fishing industry. And I can report today that Rangi Walker said the applications from Māori piled up were 2 meters high. But not a single Māori got funding. Not a single Māori got funding. So it was, we're trying to get on the Pākehā cart. No way. The Rural Bank, when that's set up, for 30 years, it gave low interest loans to farmers. In 30 years, not a single loan to Māori, even though New Zealand Māori Council made every effort to get their landowners to get some of that pūtea. And my final example would be the kohanga reo, where, our language has been forbidden to be spoken in schools. We've been belted for speaking it. And so we're looking to revive our language. And kohanga reo was not just an early childhood centre. It was really about cultural revitalisation, about real revitalisation. So government comes along and changes the criteria and force them into an early childhood education model. The result being, of course, that we had over 800 kohanga were slashed within a year to 400 kohanga. I could go on, as I'm sure Troy and Catherine could, about how Māori have really struggled against the weight of Pākehā being in the driver's cart, and ensuring that the policies, the legislation and the regulations meet the needs of those who designed that cart. And, you know, the Public Sector Act that we passed in July recognises that the public sector and government have to do better. Anyway, that's the intent. The fact of the matter is that for the last 20 years, Māori public sector has been, Māori public servants have been stable at about 13 to 15%. And in some of the key places within government which influence the Māori economy, and that includes in the Ministry for the Environment, in the climate section, in the water section, into Ururako, which looks after our forestry, in those areas that look after natural resources, there are very few Māori. And in climate change, I've been working there for the last 2 years, I haven't yet come across a single Māori in a senior management position, nor even in a junior position, nor during many of the humongous number of consultations I've been part of. It's just, oh man, honey, it's wall to wall Pākehā. You're blinded by the whiteness in the room. That's what I say when I come out. God damn, you know, you'd think this was an all white nation. But part of that is there are just so few Māori in the public sector, and they are sort of accumulated or crushed into the lower echelons, the anyway, places where Pākehā don't want to be. So there is a political issue of the treaty, and I had wanted to, but I won't have time to, but I'm just going to mention to you that water engineers, every water engineer ought to have as compulsory reading the Waitangi Tribunal report on Kaituna. Kaituna River was where the Rotorua City Council looked to divert its effluent from, I think it was Lake Rotorua, into the Kaituna River. And they objected and won their case. But today, we're still having that fight. I mean, God damn, that's 30 years ago. And to this day, we're still having a fight. Māoridom has had to step forward and say, okay, you can put your treated wastewater into our forest, because our people do not want to mix any kind of effluent into water that we swim and drink in. The second one I recommend to you is the Motunui decision. And that was in Taranaki, the last remaining seafood bed of the Tatiawa people. And Borthwick's, the meat factory there, was pumping its effluent onto the last remaining mussel bed of that tribe. And they kicked up a fuss. And it was the first time that I ever saw Pākehā and Māori working together to overturn a government decision or a council decision. It was the environmentalists of Taranaki, it was the people that fish, it was Pākehās that swim, families joined together with the people of Tatiawa to overturn it. I remember Muldoon saying at the time, over his dead body would that effluent not go into the water. And well, he died a bit later, but it did get, they did do something about it eventually. And the last one would be the Manukau Harbour. That was Nanako Minhinnick. And you have to feel the pages of their pain as they watched their harbour, this rich seafood resource being destroyed by effluent. It just says to you, everything you need to know about the Māori worldview is in those pages. And it speaks to you, even though it's print, it will speak to you of their pain. Now, finally, on the Māori worldview, I can recommend that you read the writings of Māori Marsden, the master from the north, who talks about what is the Māori worldview. And I don't think that anyone has ever come up with anything better since then. But I'm going to give you, in conclusion, my summary of a Māori worldview. So the key driver in Māoridom is whakapapa. Whakapapa is genealogy, but it's more than that. It is the way we connect to one another. And Matthew, I remember during the first hearing of the New Zealand Māori Council led claim to the Waitangi Tribunal on water, when my sister-in-law, Hera Huata, got up and spent a couple of hours giving the whakapapa from Io, from the nothingness, whakapapaing down to the first light, whakapapaing down to the many lights, whakapapaing down to the first parents, whakapapaing down from all of the brothers and sisters, and then whakapapaing down to their river. They whakapapaed to that river. Their ancestral being is tied up in that river. When Māori say, I am the water and the water is me, they literally mean, I am the water, it is part of me. And that universality, that connectedness that Māori have with the environment and with one another, that is the core tenet that can save us moving in when we look at climate change and we look at the way that the treaty settlement process has fragmented Māori leadership into little PSGEs and competing resource adversaries. And we look at a Māori worldview where in the olden days we shared resources, people came and went, and there wasn't this, things as property and time as property. So the one lesson that no one will tell you, but I'm going to tell you because I always find it missing, is the Māori view of time is the one thing you must struggle to get your head about. Because I've so often heard Pākehās say, can you get over it? Can you Māori snap out of it? And the reason we can't is because the past is the present. So when I hear my tipuna talk about the issues of the Kaituna River, and I'm sitting there, I am the living embodiment of those ancestors and of that water. And time, the fact that it's 200, 400 years ago is irrelevant because I am the living moment of that past. And when they say we walk backward into the future, looking at the past, is because that is the known. And that is how we create the future, by looking at the past. And that's one thing that Pākehā cannot do because they have amnesia. Good grief, can't even remember their great-great-grandparents. They have amnesia about what happened 30 years ago. And we're doomed under the Pākehā model to repeat the mistakes. So my take on the climate, battling as I have for the last 2 years in the climate space, is that Māori and Pākehā have such differing and opposing views of the world, and the dominant one is winning, therefore we're all losing. So as Pākehā engineers, a Pākehā who have power, then it really is on you. It is on you to deal with other Pākehās, because we are sick of your piss pot attitude. Sorry. And by that I mean the Pākehā attitude is anything piss and effluent goes into water. Water is sacred and it should never happen like that. So anyway, I'll leave you there. Hang on, I'll just go. Sorry, my daughter's ringing. Kia ora, Emily. Sorry, Dave.
Kia ora. I was going to pass a thanks, but I will quickly, I think I've still got the thoughts in my head. I'm going to share them with you all. I think there were 3 really key elements that I wanted to thank Whaidona for. Oh, here she is. Thank you, Whaidona. I have 3 points I just wanted to share that were really enlightening to me and hopefully to the rest of our audience. The analogy of the cart was one of the clearest depictions that I could actually visualize in my mind, so ngā mihi nui for that. All of these resources, I think I've got a bit of reading ahead of me. Some of them I've seen, but many I haven't. And I think we've seen a list there shared that we'll try and share links or the names of those resources to the audience. And then also the commentary around time. I think that's something that is really going to be interesting for myself as well to get my head around. So thank you again. And I'll pass over to
I'll just, before you go, pass it on, Whaidona, I just wanted to tautoko your kōrero, especially the kōrero about the North. It's always good to hear Te Aroa praise the North. So ngā mihi nui kia koe. And I very much loved your mita. Whakapaping, oh, ke te pai te rā. On that note, we'll just pass it over to the tūkana, Johnny. No he koe, ko wai koe, he aha tō mahi, bro.
Tēnā tātou katoa, e mihi kau ana kia tātou i raro i te kaupapa o te zui nei. E mihi kau ana ki nā kai tautoko o tātou huhunga a Water New Zealand, the Climate Change Rōpū. Me ki Engineering New Zealand Sustainability Society, me o tātou kai uringi, Emily Troy, nō reira tēnei te mihi kia kōrua. Mihi kawana kia koe aku taku tuakana Matthew, me ki te whaia dana nō reira tēnei te mihi kia kōrua. Yeah, sometimes it's really challenging when you're the third speaker of a panel of three. But what's really awesome is the first two speakers sort of lay our strand of our thoughts and our whakaaro. So in acknowledging Matthew's opening and where he took us in terms of water and climate and that focus around that recognition of our rights and interests as Māori, as Indigenous people, and the value we can bring to the kaupapa and kōrero. In that Te Ao Māori lens, kaitakitanga around those values, and certainly the challenges today are not just in terms of how what I refer to as square systems, Western systems recognise that, but how we navigate that within our own systems as Māori, as iwi, as Māori community, and certainly in terms of whaiadonas kōrero, especially around anchoring around te tiriti. And I really, like you, Emily, love the cart analogy. And it's a good sort of image to hold in our mind as we start to think about how we navigate that future. Where not only issues around the cart, as Matthew mentioned, around capacity and equity, you know, and that's where Māori often, we can't even put the cart before the horse because we don't even have a horse in that sense. And so, no heo, I te taho tōku pāpa, no Ngāti Chapter Waiohua, no Tamaki Makaurau, I te taho tōku māma, no Nai Tūhoi te Uruwera. I was sort of born in the little timber town of Kawerau, and I was a child of the 70s, a teenager, young person of the 80s, and we moved to Māngere, South Auckland, and grew up in that space with my dad's people. With Whai Donna mentioning the tribunal reports and in particular the Manukau report, just makes me think of our tupuna, our leader, Whai Naniko Manhinik, who had quite a significant role in terms of the kaitakitanga of our harbour, but also working with the New Zealand Māori Council in the 80s and a lot of those foundational court cases that led to things of having kaitakitanga in the RMA today. And so just really wanted to acknowledge all those that have done the work before us, and we just build from what they've laid for us, really. And I do recommend reading those tribunal reports. They articulately navigate not just whakapapa, but also treaty issues, and actually they, out of those reports, have actually laid some key sort of principles of how do we apply the treaty in a contemporary way, and really acknowledge what Whai Donna talked about, historical and cultural amnesia. And that's one of the challenges we have as Māori, is we're having to re-educate whoever the officials are before us, because bureaucratic Western organisations don't hold wisdom. They don't do intergenerational transfer of knowledge. So within our whānau, we are left holding the legacy and the hopes for our tupuna and our mokopuna. So, so my sort of contribution to the kōrero today, I think this really flows off and complements both Matthew and Whai Donna's kōrero, and sort of brings together, I guess, in terms of, in my area of work, mahi is really around how we navigate and relocate the issues within a Te Ao Māori system and way of being. And we refer to as pai whakatere, around navigating those horizons. And what's really critical and what we bring to the table as Māori, as Indigenous people, is we bring intergenerational wisdom over more than 1,000 years of living in Aotearoa. And Western systems just really focus on the future and really don't take account or really try to seek understanding or tap into that wisdom. So and that 1,000 years, if you like, within Aotearoa is on the back of over 50 to 100,000 years of being in the Pacific. in terms of when we think about whakapapa-centred systems, whakapapa-centred thinking. And one of the things I think that in a Square Systems approach is we just think Māori as either in the context of a treaty type partner, a human stakeholder for engagement. We actually don't really look to locate ourselves into those knowledge and practice systems. So we're forever having to respond to the impositions of Square Systems or Western systems thinking. And so for me, it's not just saying how do we engage with Māori, how do we actually locate ourselves within a whakapapa-centred system, way of thinking and practice, and how Western science and Mātauranga Māori can co-navigate the future together. So this is what we talk about in the sense of pai whakatiri. So I've just got a series of pictures that I'll speak to, not quite a presentation as such. So in terms of when we think about Indigenous systems thinking, it's around recircularization, regenerating whakapapa, and around our resilience. And one thing that Māori have been for the last 1,000 years, they're a resilient people. And COVID has proven that in terms of Māori-led response around caring for whānau in the way that we continue to be resilient. The only issue though is for the last 200 years, we've been forced into survival mode due to colonisation and westernisation. And our aspirations are to break out of that cycle, and how do we continue to be resilient, but from surviving to thriving. That's the key drive for us, and that's our mission we've been handed from our ancestors in that sense. The formula, the coding, if you like, is contained in our karakia, our waiata, our pepeha, our puraka, our stories. They're not myths. They're the stories that contain what we call our Māori Da Vinci Code. And in this sort of pauparapara around our bindings to the sky, our bindings to the land, our bindings to the waters, our connections as people, e rongo te po, e rongo te ao, through night and day, life and death, male and female. E rongo te po and e rongo te ao is like our Māori yin and yang. And it's really about how do we achieve balance and harmony in order for us for our Māori, our life essence to thrive. And Donna touched on in her kōrero about whakapapa and what it is. And one of the key things is that it's the whakapapa system and the bindings of the universe, which Māori Marsden touches on. It's not just human-centered whakapapa, it's our connectedness for the whole universe. So when we start to think about how we locate ourselves in the system, so this is where I sort of speak about going beyond just engagement with Māori. As a people, it's really understanding how we anchor into Māori systems thinking, which is the Te Ao Māori element. So Indigenous systems thinking, if you like. So I like using symbols like square, circle, takarangi or spiral. So we have a current Western thinking system and practice, and at the heart of it, it's patriarchal and it's about the individual. So in a sense, it's about me. In the last 30, 50 years or so, we've seen a shift towards sustainability thinking, and more recently around what we call regenerative development, regenerative thinking, and that's bringing sort of circular thinking. And at the heart of regenerative thinking, regenerative development, is around restoring that relationship or regenerating that relationship between people and nature. It's different from Te Ao Māori thinking, because our thinking is we are nature when we think about that whakapapa whakaaro. And because we live it, we can talk about, and what Whaidana talked about was those whakapapa from Io down to the Ika to us and that whole wider whakapapa system. And because that knowledge, if you like, has been corrupted in a Western sense, in the way they continue to corrupt Indigenous knowledge and co-opt it into a square way, they don't understand and see it's a theoretical thing, not a living practice belief thing. And it's like a 1 degree shift. And this is where how Indigenous people throughout the world, we still hold onto that coding, albeit in a fragmented way because of the impact of square systems. And so we need to understand that climate change isn't a new thing for Māori. But what the risk is we continue to be subjugated by Western square thinking, where we just become a group to consult with, a stakeholder, not as part of the solution and the answer of those 1,000 years of wisdom and knowledge for our whakapapa systems, you know. And so it's awesome to sort of see a shift from square to circle in a Western sense, but it's still Western whakaaro. And many of our people are being entrapped in those systems thinking, and when Whai talked about those PSG things, so free treaty settlements is the continuation of the squarisation of our systems, and we, as a result, as Māori, fall into the square system and try to, even though we have Māori whakaaro and values, it's still within a square system. So the opportunity is to take that next shift into that whakapapa-centred way of being and thinking about that whole system. So I'm not into human-centred design or co-design, because those are things that often in a public agency senses we go as Māori, as stakeholders, to help design their stuff, not relocate into the whenua, into it's a real big shift in terms of when we're starting to navigate this space, and when we think about how we locate our response to COVID, how we locate our response to climate and other issues and poverty. Because for 200 years, the square approach has failed our people and continues to limit us in that little cart, not even as a true partner in a te tiriti sense. So I've touched on the impacts. I use the term squarisation, which is code for colonisation, westernisation, and for many of our people in Tāmaki, urbanisation. And what it does is that this connection and this copulation of whakapapa. And so for us in Tāmaki, as Haukainga, as mana whenua, we have every iwi of Aotearoa that lives in Auckland. We have every iwi of the Pacific that lives in Auckland. We have a lot of refugee whānau from throughout the world that live in Auckland. So we've got all this disconnected whakapapa living in Auckland, getting dealt with in the Western Square way. And the opportunity is to shift into kaitiaki-centred, manaaki-centred whakapapa and those relationships. And we see that in the manifestation through our whānau in the criminal system, our tamariki in oranga tamariki in a square system, and we're 3rd, 4th, 5th generation of that. And it's not just going to take a transformation of a square to try and recognise Māori, it's about a relocation back into our Mātauranga, Te Ao Māori systems of being. And the opportunity of working with engineers is through engineering your role in helping enable kaitiakitanga. It's not so much about the pipe, it's about the wai and the whakapapa of the water system and the role in that kaitiaki relationship. You know, so those are sort of starting to shift that worldview in a degree. And what's exciting is driven by our kaumātua. We're seeing our rangatahi really activating and because they're challenging not only the Pākehā square system, but they're also challenging some of the square thinking of getting locked into those PSG things. You know, so this is all as much of a challenge for ourselves as Māori as we navigate that way forward. And both Matthew and Whai Donna's really touched on that core whakaaro. So in our thinking, oranga from a Māori whakaaro is anchored in whakapapa, and it's anchored in those whakapapa relationships between taiao, whenua, and tangata. So it has to be placed anchored. So how Te Arawa and their whakapapa system rolls is really anchored in Te Arawa whakapapa system. How we roll within Tāmaki is anchored in our whakapapa systems. And it's like maramataka, you can't have a universal lunar calendar across, it's localised to those local eco whakapapa systems. And what we're sort of seeing at a real whānau community level is that regeneration of those whakapapa systems. And like in Te Arawa for the last 3 years, they've regenerated their own maramataka system way of being across their rohe. So you've got to look at that place-based, understanding those whakapapa systems, of which Māori are the whenua, not just the stakeholder for engagement. You know, so these are some of the shifts we need to think. So in this sort of thinking around sort of what we call the whaioranga model, around pursuing well-being in a whakapapa-centred way. So that whole connecting and physically, mentally, spiritually connecting to place, people and nature. Whakapaparanga, that's our Māori term for regenerating whakapapa around the Māori, tapu and mana. And Whai really touched on the critical thing, and we use the term wānanga. And wānanga not in the sense of let's come have a hui in a workshop, it's about our relationship with time. So te taima, which is tick tick, 24 hours, 7 days, that's an imposed thing, Gregorian, chronological time, that came with the square. What we're talking about is te wā. is around that time and space where we get to commune, connect with our mokopuna and our tupuna, and in those places, time stands still. And this is the biggest issue with whether it's Oranga Tamariki or any other square organisation, is they try to engage whānau community in their time, not calibrating to the time of nature and to the time of whānau. And that's the biggest challenge, because everything's limited to a minute, hour, that type of thinking. So we've got it's the re-squareization of time and our people. So we get entrapped in that. So that's the biggest challenge. If we are going to truly partner with non-Māori need to relocate themselves within that state of Māori time. And it's really funny. It's an ingoing joke, well, bloody Māori time, everything starts late, but that's because you're putting a square time on it, as opposed to things will start when they're ready to start, because the kaumata are ready, we've got the key people, and then we're ready to go. And not only that, it's a good maramataka day, the tides are right. And that's one thing that COVID's teaching us, is the importance of re-syncing back to nature. Because ultimately, papa tunuku is the key determiner, not us as humans. And that's why it's really important that the square male-centered impact on our whakapapa, our regeneration and our healing is actually led through our wahine in that rebalancing. And certainly people like Whainaneko, and we've still got a few of those taniwha left around the Manukau, Carmen Kirkwood and others. Whaia Julie Wade, around our marae, and they're still there to help anchor us. And the other day they were presenting before the tribunal around the Oranga Tamariki hearing, around talking about whakapapa-centered care. And what we're sort of seeing, if you like, is co-modification of whakapapa because of those Western systems coming into place. So, and navigating horizons. And so for us, again, using our own knowledge systems, that the vision, the compass actually sits in the stars, in the environment, and the way our tupuna navigated. And in the last 30 years, we've seen the regeneration of our navigating, voyaging whakapapa for a number of people like Matua Busby and others. But it's bringing this long-term view of, we have a deep past, pai tawhito, so we need to bring that knowledge and wisdom of our past with us as we navigate the space before us in that today, in that pai watu space, the immediate future, and then beyond the horizon. And Pairangi is actually where our aspirations, where our vision sits, because as the water gets and the storms happen, it's easy to lose sight of where we're trying to navigate to. So we've got to elevate, and this is where our intergenerational vision sits, if you like. And really what we're trying to transform in the state of well-being is from that state of Māori noho, Māori mate, the state of illness, to Māori tu, Māori ora, which is real that flourishing, and how we enable our whānau to navigate their own pathways in that way. So things like mana motuhake is not just a theoretical, aspirational, it gets activated and enabled at a whānau level. And then the last few slides I just want to sort of touch on, which both Whaidana and Matthew's already touched on, but when we talk about mana motuhake, for us it's the flip side of oranga, and it's around oranga whakapapa, so the well-being of those whakapapa systems and connections and understanding oranga whenua, how we anchor to that sense of place, sense of belonging, oranga taio, the whakapapa relationships with nature, and oranga tangata in terms of our whānau, our people, our and this is not just, when we talk about a Māori system thinking, it's not just for Māori, it's for everyone. And that's the critical thing. So often what happens is the Māori view, people think square systems, people interpret that, oh, that's a Māori thing. No, we're in Aotearoa, this is our location of this whakapapa, and how do we anchor ourselves as all New Zealanders into the whenua. If we're with our whananga people in Tonga, then it'll be a Te Ao Tonga worldview that we need to navigate by, or whatever the location. And so what happens is people bring all their different whakaaro and don't acknowledge the whenua and they're anchoring on that whole system. And then it's been reshaped through colonisation to reflect a different worldview. So the place of the treaty, in a sense of how we think about the way we could work together. And so in that sense, we talk about kawanatanga stewardship, duty of care. That's that part around Article 1 that Whaidana talked about. The rangatiratanga, kaitiakitanga, and manakitanga of Article 2 is really about that co-partnership around how do we navigate well-being together. And then the oretitanga, if you like, is where those rights and interests start to sit. It then creates us what we call about this navigating dual knowledge around Mātauranga Māori Western science. And I've got no issues of using Western methods, but it needs to sit in a Te Ao Māori methodology. What we see is a co-opting of Māori bits and pieces back into the square. And so, you know, and for us, the outcome of that is around a beautiful whakatauki, ko te hao te whenua, ko te hao te tangata. So the essence of the land and the vitality of the people. It's that whakapapa, and it's really the well-being of our whakapapa system. The whenua, wai, marae, whānau, it's the interconnectedness of those relationships. And that's it. This, you know, so really building off what Whaidonna and Matthew had spoken about earlier, and really, I guess my contribution is talking about how we locate ourselves within our Te Ao Māori system, way of being, way of doing, and it's not just for Māori. It's and some exciting things that are evolving is around whakapapa partnerships between tangata whenua, tangata Pacifica as tangata moana. Because Western systems put us into these square boxes, Māori, Pacifica, and whereas we come from the Pacific, we're Monanuiaki, we're Pacific people as well. Our tupuna arrived as Pacific, and so this is what Whaia mentioned around the historical and cultural amnesia. And we're getting caught up in the square, where actually the circle way, the takarangi spiral way of navigating in a whakapapa-centred way is part of that focus on our well-being in an economic, environmental, social, cultural sense, which, you know, so it's about locating those things into the circle way of thinking and being in the Te Ao Māori way. So, which our tupuna, our kaumātua hold on to, it's how we translate that in our generation in a contemporary way of navigating this space. So, you know, so it's about those, the difference between what I call the ologies and all those branches of Western science versus the tangas, which is the bindings, the reciprocity of obligations, responsibilities to whakapapa. And you know, and so, and all those things are hidden in plain sight because it all sits in Taio. And we were diving into the books in that to try and get Mātauranga. We actually, all our tupuna did was live and connect to those whakapapa systems, and the knowledge was revealed to them by nature. And that's what sort of our interpretation of COVID as a tohu. What's Papa Tunuku really communicating to us? Climate change, same sort of response from those atua tupuna in that way. So there's tohu there, they're all hidden in plain sight, and it's how we start to tune into those things. And if you like, apply a Māori logic in a way of navigating our future. Not just think of Māori as people to engage with or partner. This is beyond all those bureaucratic square things. So kia ora tātou.
Ora, thank you very much, Johnny, for your kōrero. I think, again, it's really enlightening and building on what we've already heard from Matthew and Donna. You are right that they paved the way. Sometimes they might cover some of your topics, but then they open up new strands of thought process. I really appreciate the thoughts around intergenerational wisdom, looking both forwards and backwards to learn from the past. That was also reflected in Whaia Donna's kōrero, and the commentary around whakapapa-centric design and the difference between preservation and conservation, regeneration of nature versus being one with nature and being part of nature. I think that was quite a key theme that carried through for me. So thank you again very much. I think we're on to question time now, so I'll pass the rako to Troy to ask our first questions. I think there's been quite a few coming through and getting upvoted.
Yeah, ngā mihi nui ki ngā kai kōrero o te wā. That was just amazing to hear your insights, where you're from, what you've been working on, and a glimpse into Te Ao Māori. It's just beautiful. Makes me very proud to be, as my parents would say, a child of the treaty, my Pākehā side and my Māori side. So it makes me very proud to be here today and have you all on the screen. Right now we have time for some questions. We're gonna end this webinar at 1:30. If you have to log off, it is being recorded, so We know time is money out there in the consultancy world, but please, if you want to stay and listen to the questions, that'd be much appreciated. If you have any questions to us, please head over to the Slido.com and enter in the code 12980, and feel free to ask any questions and also to be able to vote them up and down. So we are going to head over to the Slido now. And the first question we've got, and I'm going to send it over to you, Matthew, firstly. And it's from Chris, and it says, as a Pākehā non-Indigenous New Zealander or immigrant, how can I integrate your lessons in my work in the water industry in a respectful, non-token way?
Well, thank you. That's actually a really great question. So thank you for that. And just I also want to total the words around Johnny's presentation as well. I really enjoyed that. As I always do, Donna's as well. And Donna, I saw your message. I'll give you a call after this one. If I could encourage people, and this will be in two parts, there's 5 things I encourage everybody to do to integrate Māori words and thinking and practice into their organisations. The first is to better understand kaitiakitanga. Kaitiakitanga and the art of guardianship is not just something that we talk about, it's something that we actively do. And it would be absolutely critical, I think, for organisations to better understand that relationship that Māori have with both the whenua, the water and the air up there. So kaitiakitanga and an understanding of it is important. The second, which is a little bit off the beaten track, is what I call haputanga. Haputanga is really, really important because we get ourselves so whipped up into a frenzy and dealing in national conversations, which are important, but actually things happen at the local level with marae and hapu. It's marae and hapu that sit at the centre of many of the ecosystems that traverse our land. So having relationships with local hapu and marae is so critically important. And that doesn't take away from iwi, actually it doesn't take away from iwi at all, it strengthens the proposition of working as collectives. The next is to better understand the world of Mātauranga Māori. It's one of the things that fascinates me the most. It's one of the big discussions out there at the moment. How do we integrate the world of Mātauranga Māori into the traditional ways and forms that we see Western science and Western infrastructure, Western systems and so on and so forth? Actually, they can cohabitate nicely within each other as opposed to having to focus completely all on the university style or academic approach we sometimes traditionally take. The fourth thing I encourage people to understand is the history of things. The whakapapa that Donna talks about so vividly and so richly, but also the whakapapa of the claims that have been brought by Māori. I'm very fortunate to have Dame Minhinnick's son, Roimata Minhinnick, as a member of my New Zealand Māori Council National Executive. I know all about the Manukau claims, I know all about the water claims, all about the fisheries claims. And actually, you know what, there's a lot that can be said for just sitting down and reading those documents. I see somebody posted a link in the chat room about a consolidation of those documents that the Ministry, I think, of the Environment has put out there. I encourage you to understand the history of things. And then the fifth thing is the Māori ecosystem. You know, the way the Māori ecosystem works is actually vastly different to how a traditional ecosystem would be viewed in the scientific context of the Western academic approach. And because it's not, the Māori ecosystem isn't just about one thing, it's about how all the branches of the Te Ao Māori world branch off from each other and then reconnect later on down the line, or stay connected or remain connected. That Māori ecosystem, the integration of tikanga, of Te Reo Māori, of Mātauranga Māori, of haputanga, of maraetanga, I'll throw another one in there, is so critically important to understand how that works. And then to finally answer that other question around engagement, it's always, and I encourage this, it's always better to engage first, not last. I think Māori are very sick and tired of waiting for an email to come that says, well, now that we've finished all this consultation, we'd like to begin our Māori engagement. Well, actually, no. You're better suited to start off engaging with Māori from the very beginning. We can actually teach you things through both local and oral history that you will never know or understand. But if you don't get there, you'll be the worst for it. So engage with Māori from the very beginning. And don't be afraid to engage with us. We're not taniwha. Well, no, most of us are not taniwha. I believe there are probably some people out there that think I'm the grandest taniwha of them all, lurking around in the corner somewhere, which can be true, you know, if you engage with me last and not first. So, you know, engaging with us, don't be scared, don't be frightened. You don't have to understand it all Māori yourselves. It's about engaging in a conversation about how we can bridge a divide in thinking and understanding. So that would be my response on that front.
Cool, ngā mihi, Meshu. Johnny, I just wanted to have a inkling of your of your perspective, being mana whenua in Tamaki Makaurau and all the water projects going on in Tamaki at the moment, especially in the Ngāti Tiata in the South Auckland around Te Manukau as well. Just wanted to hear your perspective on that as well.
Yeah, I think really want to support what Matthew talked about. You got to sort of think about beyond engagement, you know, and in a way it's relationship before partnership, because for us, you know, we've had 180 years of this kōrero, and you know, and to be honest, the degradation of the harbour reflects the degradation of our people, and that's what people don't understand. It's the same whakapapa system as Matthew talked about, and it's understanding it's the whole interconnected system. And our tamariki that are coming into Oranga tamariki, same whakapapa of the harbour, but these different systems cut it up into those ology bits and separate it all. And if, in order to heal our people, we've got to heal our harbour. It's the same, you know, just read the tribunal report. So some of it's not rocket science. You know, so some key points I'd focus on is context. Understand the context of that space, the history. You know, there's some awesome resources. Sort of do your homework, because often people come to engage with us about a project, but don't understand what the kaupapa and those other things. You know, so context is important. Location, and I love Matthew's whakaaro around the marae haputanga. Auckland Council has a list of 19 iwi, but that doesn't necessarily translate to the kaitiaki on the whenua and that knowledge. They're you know, and are becoming, because of RMA kaitiakitanga, is almost like a mailbox of connection, not actually around how do we have that deeper kōrero. So, and the other thing, which Whaia mentioned, was time. Come to engage and sit with our people in our time, not in a, I've got an hour to talk about a project or whatever. And you need to talk about time, investing and building a relationship, not just come for a series of meetings to talk about a project. And it might be come to the pokai, come to hui, come to just spend, because we have this thing around kanohi kiti. If you're face seen, we notice when you're not around, in a sense. So just don't think about project level engagement, but think about kaupapa level and over time. And if anything, patience, perseverance, and purposeful intention. So you know, and I think those are, you know, and you need to sit to listen to the 180 years of our experience, and it's actually almost through the perseverance and the resilience that people need to build in those relationships. And there's been some real awesome examples of organisations shifting to that way of working. And I think one of the key things, there needs to be a bit of a mental shift, especially from a water infrastructure perspective. So often the conversation is around the management of water infrastructure or the management of water as a resource. But if you shift your thinking around the kia o whakapapa and that water as whakapapa, not even a taonga, because taonga sometimes becomes like almost treated like an asset. So when you start to think about te aki whakapapa, te aki wai from that perspective, then your role as engineers in the care of whakapapa, in the care of water, and if you start that sort of conversation with mana whenua marae, with our people, then that starts to shift from a square thinking of managing to a circle thinking of care of whakapapa. Now, whether it's water, whether it's tamariki, or whether it's whatever the kaupapa is about, when you start to bring that thinking, and when you shift the thinking around care or whakapapa, who needs to be involved other than yourself as an engineer? Then instead of this bilateral, oh, I've got to go and talk to iwi, we start to think about a care relationship of whakapapa. Oh, the people that are connected to the land, the water itself, and so you create this triangle of care around that kaupapa, around that whakapapa. So you know, I think it's we've got to get out of this RMA kaitiaki. Our people become entrapped in the definition of kaitiaki. And we say even in post-settlement co-management things, you can't express kaitiakitanga at a table. Kaitiakitanga exists in intergenerational transfer of knowledge and practice between our older people and our tamariki, and that's what we want to see is practical expression of those sort of outcomes, because that's where the intergenerational knowledge and practice occurs, not at a co-management table, not at a hearing. That's a whole lot of square stuff, you know. We're geared up to that because we are bicultural people. We can coexist in both square and circle. Not everyone can do that, but that's because of the imposition of the square. Our people have had to adapt, and it goes back to that analogy of the fires around the two carts. It takes me back to my childhood growing up in Māngere, that we used to look forward to every inorganic rubbish collection because that's where we make our carts and trolleys to have our races down the hill. So people are, Māori are resilient and adaptive in that sort of innovative thinking, you know. So I think that's where I'd sort of just tie it back down to is context, location, time, and think about the te ake o whakapapa, the kia o whakapapa in your own thinking around how you're going to approach this opportunity.
Mihi, Johnny. Whae Donna, I've got a couple of questions here for you around time. For the first, he pātai tuatahi, just picking up on Matthew's and Johnny's kōrero around time and the need to meet with mana whenua, iwi, Māori, and how in the aspect of time and like not just turning up on the door. So my question to you for the first question is, how easy is it to have these kōrero with Māori and partner with Māori? Is it a matter of just, you know, ringing them up and having a coffee or a cup of tea with them?
No, my view of time wasn't about spending time. It was about how we exist in time. So it's our mindset is constantly on, you know, what happened in the past. So we bring the past vividly into the present, and also about, you know, looking after our resources for the future. So my thinking of kaitiakitanga isn't that, you know, I think that thinking we're the kaitiaki is such an arrogant Western view. In fact, really the environment is the kaitiaki of us. And we personify that in our taniwha. You know, we say the taniwha are our kaitiaki, not just of the waters and the resources, but they're actually our kaitiaki. So it is you know, the concept of utu is so badly understood, that notion of reciprocity, the balance between everything. But actually, I won't answer that question because I wanted to just raise one thing before I go for our Pākehā engineers, which is that, you know, if I was to now go out, let's just say I had a 1.5 hour webinar with some engineers about water engineering, and then I go out and I put my shingle up and start doing some water engineering, integrating water engineering into climate change or whatever, it would be madness. And in fact, the Māori worldview and our history is as complicated as getting an engineering degree, if not more. And so it's about investing in yourself. The key concept you need to take away from this, apart from whakapapa, is racism. Racism is, when I first started out in my first treaty protest was in 1971, the first time we ever went up to Waitangi to protest at government celebration of the incredibly fabulous state of our race relations. We went up there to say, no, it's not fabulous, you have breached the treaty. That was 1971. And racism was something that we recognized. It was when you couldn't get a landlord to give you a flat or in jobs. And we tend to think that because 50 years has gone under the bridge, that, oh, things have magically changed. But in actual fact, as someone who was there then and who's still here now, racism is very much alive and well. It hasn't gone anywhere. It has merely been, it comes out in different ways. It's not as obvious, but believe you me, it is as fierce today as it was in the 70s. I was working in bicultural training in the 80s and 90s. It is as fierce today. And I'm telling you, I've spent the last 2 years meeting with bureaucrats who are even more racist than the bureaucrats I met in the 80s and 90s, because now they speak a bit of reo, they can do a pohiri, they can do a karakia of the kai, they got all the little tricks of the book, but in actual fact, when it comes to allowing Māori to get on that cart, no way. They got the boot out, they'll push you off, you're clutching onto the cart, and these bloody porphyry speaking bureaucrats are booting you off. So racism is the key. And whatever else you do, spending time with Māori, unless you address your own racism, not just the, you know, what they call institutional racism, just means that your cart was made by Pākehā, for Pākehā, with Pākehā. That's all that means. But the fact that racism is the excuse that we are somehow not, you know, we're not worthy beings to be on that thing, and only you know better. Well, what I've learned in 2 years in climate change is that Pākehā have no goddamn idea what they're doing. The leadership is appalling. I mean, how do you get a zero carbon bill and regulations that give a free pass of 82% of the pollution? 82%, and then they say, here's 18%. The rest of the community, we're going to consult on how we're going to reduce that 18%. What about the 82% that you have allowed big business and the agribusiness to get a free pass on? So what we're up against in climate is racism on the one hand, and this white superiority, which is the same thing, and white privilege. And then on the other hand, we've got vested interests. The vested interests can actually be Māori, as the example being Ngāi Tahu. You know, Ngāi Tahu sits on the climate change, interim climate change, and then is party to a report that basically gives farmers a free pass, protecting its agribusiness interests. So agribusiness and thing have a lot to answer for, business, and that's what we're up against. That's why the RMA, when Shane Jones was a kid, he was in the 80s, fighting for the RMA, leading the charge for us, and getting what we thought was a way of ensuring the sustainable native species, biodiversity, all of that. And only to look at it now, set up a special ministry of the environment. You know, mainly Pākehā's in there, and you wonder, how did we get from that vision that Shane led in 1990, in those late 80s, to what we have now, which is a complete degradation of our environment? That's what, and unless you address the issue of racism, white superiority, whites and white supremacy, today, in the people that you work with, Troy, Emily, and Catherine, your colleagues carry all of those attitudes, they're alive in them. And of course, they're going to leave it to you three to organize stuff for them, to actually help them do their job better in a very transactional way. And thank you very much, Troy, Emily, and Catherine, for doing all these work. But really the issue is, you people, Water New Zealand, your racism, and that's what we're up against. We're just doing our best to mute the worst of it. But in actual fact, unless Pākehā take responsibility for driving the cart and driving us over the edge of the precipice and allowing Māori to get in the driver's seat, then it's just not a good outlook. You know, all our Mātauranga, you look at Ngāi Tahu, for all their cleverness in fighting for agribusiness, as climate change increases, all their Mātauranga about their fisheries is of nothing, because all their fisheries have moved south with climate change. So, you know, you're clever on the one hand and stupid on the other. But anyway, good luck to you, Troy, Emily, and Catherine, for organising this. But honestly, you Pākehās in the room, you just got to step up. I mean, we're all exhausted from you.
Ngā mihi, whaia. Straight to the point.
Hang on, you know, on that zero carbon bill, we had this consultation that Ururako and Ministry for the Environment, and I went to a whole number of them. Firstly, very few Māori in the room. When they were in the room, they never spoke. When we looked at the submissions, there were 23 submissions from Māori, 15,009 from Pākehās. That doesn't tell you that what they say is, oh, Māori aren't interested. we are passionately interested in the environment, but we are also exhausted and cynical about the processes that the Crown runs, that in the end we put all this, our consultation into, and what do we get out of it? Nothing. And that's what happened with the zero carbon bill. You know, we say it's great, but if you read the 23 submissions of Māori, well, we're uniform. What we want is co-design, co-management, co-governance. Did we get it? Nothing like that.
Do you think that, from what you can see of the water industry and the environmental professional industry, do you think we're on the right track towards forming this co-design, co-management approach?
Absolutely not. No way near. God damn, it's all fake. You know, it's like it's like those examples that I gave you. I don't know if I said it, but you know, like fisheries and rural bank. It's all, oh look, it's there and you can participate. But then they put the rules in place that actually exclude you. So no, we are definitely nowhere near it. If you look at, we've been trying to get a co-partnership with water. And iwi chairs put up a water plan, the claimants put up a water plan, but the Ministry for the Environment chose who would be on Kahui Māori. The government, the Crown, is choosing which Māori they engage with. The climate change group that I sat on with New Zealand Māori Council and others, the Crown chose us. And then if you didn't say what they liked, for me as Māori Climate Commissioner, I really do, we got deleted off. So where the Crown controls the processes, you can't get co-governance. That really, I think iwi chairs, New Zealand Māori Council, we ourselves have to get ourselves together in a, if you like, a Crown grouping that sets us up to begin those conversations, and we're nowhere near that. We've been so demoralised and fragmented by the treaty settlement process that we haven't got ourselves together yet. And we better hurry up and do so, because Pākea's, it's just nowhere near, you know, but good luck to you, Troy, and good on you for putting this on.
Well, I see the raru that's happening in one of my own iwis up in Ngāpuhi, with regards to the treaty settlements and, you know, them trying to split it open left, right and centre. And it's heartening to see that we sometimes have hapu versus hapu going on at the moment. These discussions, these angry discussions going on.
And it's for nothing, it's for peanuts. You know, as somebody pointed out, government spent more in 2 years on prisons than it has in 30 years of treaty settlements. We're fighting over peanuts, and it's just irrelevant. You know, we're fighting to get a Māori health authority set up. It's doomed to failure because they will never give us enough to run it properly. They'll keep all the money for themselves, just as they've done with whānau ora. We get that amount of the money, we take that amount of the responsibility, then they slam us because we don't deliver the outcomes, but they hold all the money. Anyway, you know, there's no good news at the end of this. And I don't want your people going away thinking, oh, la, 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 la. Wasn't that wonderful? Gosh, I love those speakers. No, 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 no. Now the work begins. And, you know, we're watching. Māoridom are watching. All I can say is good on you three, you know, you Māori, for putting your hands up to really open the door for Water New Zealand. But my God, water engineers have a lot to answer for up and down this country. They really do. The racism in water engineers. And it's the same racism that Hilda Helgard faced when when they were doing the haka, you know, getting drunk, putting on their outfits, doing the haka
party.
They haven't, you know, engineers, you haven't really changed. You just stopped doing that part, but you, in other ways, you're doing it. And then to think that you can just come along and have a consultation with us, you know, that helps you do your job better. No, 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 no. A lot more is required of you.
Yeah, total kudana. That's really, thank you for saying it straight and how it is. I think there's a long way to go, and there's a lot of people who are trying to make progress. Just the number of attendees here who are interested in this kaupapa and wanting to learn more, and the questions that they're asking about how to do it respectfully and in the right manner without it being token, hopefully is an indication of the way that we're moving. So I think we're very short on time, but I thought maybe, Johnny, one quick question to sneak in at the end that's come through. It was one of the top voted questions that's coming through from Slido. We haven't made great inroads into the number of them, but do you have thoughts on what would be the top 3 things to focus on to achieve both the Māori worldview of sustainability and the shorter term climate change target?
Yeah, I think too that, you know, and to just follow on from Whaia's whakaaro, that, you know, for us, for our local people in the Manukau, the Crown's not the place for us. It's from the whenua, and we've been able to achieve more in the last 2 or 3 years in the way we've co-partnered with the kaunihira around water and those sort of aspects around climate, around being able to shift into a Mātauranga Māori-led. And certainly within COVID, we've seen the value of a Māori-led response around the care of our whānau. I think people are still are not getting it, you know, because if we don't sort ourselves in a human sense, Papa Tunuku is just going to remove us. And COVID's a good example. And because of that dysfunction, disconnection of agencies, it's our whānau Māori-led response. And people are sort of talking about, you know, post-COVID. Well, we haven't even got post-COVID. We're still applying pre-COVID thinking, as Whaia's talked about, and in this sort of myth of a post-COVID environment, and we've done well. All we've done is just moved it from our whānau bubbles to the border. And our concern for our people here in Tāmaki wasn't about when we were level 4, back in the beginning, is when we got to level 1. And that racism that occurred with our Māori Pacific whānau that was seen as the second, you know, when Tāmaki went into level 3, and as an outcome we lost 2 ki rangatira whanati raukawa as a result of that. You know, so if anything, Māori-led response, co-partnering, you know, when you want to co-partner, you should start from Article 2 view, not Article 1. And while the Crown talks about the treaty partnership, it's still, because the problem with the Crown, it believes in its own sovereignty and the arrogance that comes with it. So it's not just the institutional racism that Whaia talked about, or the unconscious bias of whether it's social workers, engineers. It's the kawanatanga bias, which is the arrogance of believing in their own sovereignty. So therefore, you never treat your partner as a true partner.
That's right.
You know, and so no wonder we face a lot of family harm, because the Crown's the perpetrator that flows through our whakapapa in that way. So to really get that balance is really critical. It needs to take a real localised response, because, as I said, each whakapapa system locally is its own whaka, so you can't apply a universal approach from Wellington. Now, how Te Arawa roll, how Ngāti Chata roll, well, it's based on those, and Matthew touched around those ecosystems. Those are whakapapa systems. So for us, we had 800 years of navigating our way. We believe that Mātauranga Māori is not just a solution for Māori, but it's a solution for humanity. So it's going to take a bit of humility of our whanaunga people in terms of tauiwi and that and I think one of those best things is, how do we start to locate ourselves in the whakapapa system of Aotearoa or locally within, and being able to say, hey Te Arawa, hey, you've lived here for over 1,000 years, or your knowledge can help us deal with those Western systemic issues, you know. And I think how we help locate engineers in that way is that, you know, and for me, the opportunity around COVID and climate is how we actually reprioritise what's important. And for me, water should sit at the heart. Climate change is part of that. Poverty is the other part. And if we're to use a Mātauranga Māori-led way, which is what Whaia talked about, the utunga, the reciprocity. When we talk about reciprocity and balance of those whakapapa systems, it's then about our obligations, responsibilities as humans in relation to our tuakana in terms of the environment. And they're as Whaia said, that's the ultimate kaitiaki of us. Who are we in our little time on this place to start saying that we're the kaitiaki? That's what's got to flip. We've got to, and both in a Māori sense, we've got to challenge our own Māori way of thinking, because that's been trapped in the square, what Whaia was talking about. And you see our leadership decision making split it into economic and environmental. We're turning into Pākehā way of thinking. We've got to go back to whakapapa centred when it's about whakapapa in that way, so that we don't start to split the thinking and practice into those ology things. It goes back to the tangas, you know. So yeah, so I'm just following on the footsteps of our leaders like Whaia Naneko and that. And on both my Tūhoe side and my Ngāti Chata side, we've got really strong women leadership. So for us, it's play our role as men and being a bit humble. and coming into tautoko. And it's about that balance, because we see that in rangi papa, the balance of rangi and papa. You know, so how we anchor ourselves into the whakapapa, and taio will always have its answers if we are be patient, listen in that time relationship around te wā, not te taima.
Right. So linked to that then, one of the other questions was, what do you currently think are the biggest barriers to change towards carbon zero in New Zealand? If we're talking about a fundamental change and shift like change in the system, what are those biggest barriers then?
Well, square systems thinking.
Yeah.
Is that arrogance that you know, that comes out of that. It's so human centered. It's so male centered.
Yeah.
And I think that the key, and I think, and I'm not saying that those carbon targets and that aren't important, but where do the measures sit? So for us, you know, in the work that Ngāti Whātua are doing around the regeneration of the whakapapa of the Kaipara Harbour, so the reduction of sedimentation as a target, and we saw this in COVID, is that we've got to start to reduce the human impact and the human behaviour in order to create enough breathing space for Papa Tunuku to regenerate himself. Because who are we to regenerate Papa Tunuku or water or those things? We've got to change our human behaviour. Those targets are important, because the thing is that if we didn't exist, Papa Tunuku will regenerate herself anyway. See, that's the thing. In our human arrogance, the whole kōrero around climate carbon reduction is about how we're going to save the world. Actually, it's about saving us, because the world's been here for millions of years before we ever existed, and we've only been here for a few 100,000 years. So that's context of understanding the past and our place in relation to that, and then how we navigate that future. And so it's about, we need to shift our behaviour. Those targets are really important, because they look to focus on shifting our human impact.
Yeah.
And what we saw in the fact that when we went into level 4 for COVID, is one of the first times that the whole of humanity since the Ice Age were in a rahui. We think we put the rahui on nature. No, it's the other way around. But what we saw was this resurgence of regeneration of those whakapapa systems when they were left alone to be who they are, as opposed to being impacted on by humans. That's the shift. That, you know, so that's the opportunity, but also the blockage is if we don't actually see that, and it's all being revealed around us through climate change. You know, and we're seeing those strong Western square systems holding on to themselves because they're trying to hold on to power. And as part of nature, for us as tangata whenua, it impacts on us in the same way. And we've got all the evidence of all the negative stats to show how Western systems are failing our people as part of nature, you know, part of that whakapapa. So that's what I say. So there's this mental block around, you know, so our whakaaro, part of our mission is how to become more of aware of the square in order to recognise the circle. And that's where we need to relocate ourselves. You know?
Just wary of time, so I'm just going to leave this one as the last question today. We have gone over, but I think it's quite an important question to ask. And maybe if I pass it over to Whae Donna and in the first instance, and Johnny, if you wanted to add on to the end, we'll use this question as our final wrap-up. But Whae Donna, how might we empower Māori to become leaders in this space and capture/utilise our Mātauranga to create meaningful change?
I was just thinking as Johnny was talking about the key recommendation of the Kahui Wai that they made in their Te Mano o Te Wai report, which was to end that within 3 years that governments sort out the ownership of the water, the governance, the management of the water. And to me, that is getting us on. It's getting us on the cart. And and you know, I really love for Water New Zealand and water engineers to think about this, because, you know, local governments just haven't been able to step up to do the job. So I think that acknowledging ownership is going to be a big step. I think going back to acknowledging that a mistake was made in the foreshore and seabed issue, and many tribes that have never renounced their, you know, ownership of that part of the foreshore. the regular marine and coastal just doesn't allow them to have it. So, you know, for us to take leadership, there are some underpinning values, which is that basically the Crown, Pākehā, is saying, no, you don't own anything. When you're talking about leadership, you mean you're looking at leadership on some kind of superficial way. I think we have to get back to the fundamental issue of let's get our cart back going, and ownership of the water and ownership of the foreshore and seabed, and return of some key resources is actually about let's get that cart on its way. I think that's the key. Everything else is we're tinkering around the edges.
Yeah, koe Johnny, anything to add there?
You know, I support that whakaaro because, you know, and I guess this is the challenge just post-elections that we've got a window of opportunity with the size of the Māori caucus, and I guess the challenge for our new government is what fundamental change now that you can rule alone. What are you actually going to do with that? And I think ownership of water, and I think because at the end of the day, what have we got to lose in 180 years of square imposition? You know, so we've got to put this into context, eh? You know, so we're not just talking about the last 3 years of Oranga Tamariki or 30 years from Puatea Tatu. We're talking about 200 years of squareisation.
Yeah.
And the real opportunity is actually let Māori steer our waka, you know, because you'll see a shift based on those values, the reciprocity and a whakapapa-centred response, not just for Māori, for all of us. Because one thing people don't understand is our obligations and responsibilities to whakapapa, not only in a kaitiaki sense, but in a manaki sense, is that we're here, and because we know this system, we know those things, our obligations are on us to be there. Pākehā don't have to carry that, but we do. And it's as simple as when people come onto your marae, who do you feed first? Do you feed yourself or do you feed your manawhiri? See, that is as simple as that. We've had all these people arrive in our land. If we take on Western way, of course we'll just feed ourselves, but that's not inherent in our values or our culture. And that's what Western systems, Pākehā, don't understand, because this is about mana, not power. You know, and I think this, you know, the waka's being steered, or the cart is being steered one way for 180 years. And because we're thinking not just about 3 years, we're thinking about our tupuna and our mokopuna. So it's an intergenerational response. And if we've got to do it in that Western way around ownership, but we'll still manifest that around those values, you know. And we've already got examples of those in the way that through COVID, you know, the marae looked after all people, not just Māori. You know, and there's a window there, I think, that could be simply answered in the next 3 years if it was just one thing like the ownership of water. So that's the challenge to the Crown, the challenge for all of us in that way of, and I think we're ready for it in that sense. We, you know, because I don't want my mokopuna to sit here in a similar webinar to talk about the same things, you know, and which will be, you know, we're only 20 years away from 200 years of the treaty. So we can do some significant movement in the next 3, in the next 20, because I think about who's going to be sitting here in 2040 having a similar kōrero. And when we look back, can we say, actually, this is where we navigated away from this way?
On that note, ngā mihi nui kia koutou, kia koutou Matthew. Unfortunately, Matthew had to leave a bit earlier, so he's going to catch up on the recording. But ngā mihi nui kia koutou, kia koutou. I tai mai nei ki te kōrero kia mātou i tēnei wā. A beautiful kōrero today. Tēnua tāhua. We heard about the role that Māori can play or do play, and how the roles of non-Māori can play in partnerships. We learned about today around Māori worldviews and the many Waitangi tribunal reports that go into quite a lot of detail. We heard from whakapapa and the ideology of whakapapa, principle of whakapapa and the Māori view of time. We heard about square systems, circles, systems and how to locate yourself in the whenua, in the place. And we learnt about Māori logic. We heard examples about, climate change and the loss of urupa, and whenua, and the degradation of our harbours and our awas. And overall, we learnt more about this Māori worldview of climate change and carbon. So thank you so much to our kai kōrero today for those insights. Also, thank you to all our listeners today. We had over 500 registrations to this recording. I was watching the participants. I think we got up to around 240, maybe 250 at the peak time. Oh, and that's just me, Haro, to see all those people in our industry wanting to learn more about Te Ao Māori and how they can incorporate and implement it into their work and in our industry that we love so much. We didn't get to all the questions today. I think we may have answered only between 5 or 6 questions today. On Slido at the moment, I think there's over 40 left to answer. Unfortunately, we can't answer them all today, but I thank you to all the attendees out there who have put those questions down. These questions are not going to be lost. They're not going to be discarded. We are going to keep them, and I think we're going to have a good debrief after this, and we're going to look at rolling this out into more webinars. So we'll use these questions that we've got today to form further webinars coming up over the next 12 months. So thank you so much. Also, just a big shout out to Water New Zealand, the Climate Change Group, Engineering New Zealand, the Sustainability Society for supporting this kaupapa. When we had a little discussion around it, there was no question that from these industries that they wanted to get behind it and tautoko it. So thank you so much. There was a few questions that I got privately, but also publicly around Māori in our industry that have not met other Māori in our industry. On their capability and capacity, if you are Māori or if you're a supporter of Māori and you want to connect with others in the industry, please look myself up, look up Emily. Feel free to contact the panelists on this call as well, and just reach out and let's form those groups and have a kōrero. I can say for the Māori engineers out there that are listening, we're looking to hold a wānanga in Auckland later in November around how little Māori there are currently in our industry and in the way of trying to regrow it and growing those rates and supporting our rangatahi getting into STEM projects and also STEM professions and also going to the university and into our engineering industry. As you heard from Matthew, there's only like 5 engineers, water engineers that are Māori out there that we know of. I'm sure there's more than that, so feel free to connect with us as well. But yeah, thank you so much to everyone today. This has just been amazing. On that note, I'll hand it over to the tuahine who add a final remark and close us off with a karakia.
Kia ora, thank you, Troy. No, I think I don't have a lot to add. We've covered such a rich kōrero today. I think what's been the most exciting part out of it is seeing all of these questions that can lead to more hui, more wānanga, and more kōrero just amongst our peers. It doesn't have to be in a webinar format like this. So if we can build capacity within our own organisations and find the people to reach out to share knowledge and to learn from, because I think we're all on this journey, we're all on this haerenga to embrace Te Ao Māori. Some further along the ladder than others, but it's an ongoing journey. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you so much for coming today. Right, me karakia tātou. Unihia ki te uru tapunui. Kia wātia, kia māma, te ngākau, te tinana, te wairua i te ara takata. Koia rā e rongo whakairia ake ki runga kia tīna. Huie tai ki e.
Ka kite, everybody.
Ka kite. Kia pai tōra.